best thing to do in the case of Israel is to recognize there's been a failure for Iran. And so they should, as President Biden has said to them, as it were, take the win and then move on to focus on how to eradicate Hamas in Gaza and how to get those hostages free.
I don't think we should be pulling Israel back and warning them not to retaliate militarily. I think if Iran pays no military costs, especially in that IRGC infrastructure, maybe even the nuclear program, they have learned a lesson that they can escalate to this extent, and this becomes the new baseline for further escalation.
President Biden is said to have told Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, "You've got to win, take the win." That was a plea not to retaliate after Iran's massive missile and drone attack crashed uselessly against Israel's Iron Dome defence shield. The British RAF helped in that defence. So does the government here also want Israel to take the win? Let's speak to David Cameron, Lord Cameron, who's the Foreign Secretary. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Do you think that Israel should take the win?
I think that's right. I mean, we should first of all reflect that this was a pretty significant attack. I mean, 110 ballistic missiles, 36 cruise missiles, 185 drones. And so, of course, Israel has every right to respond as an independent sovereign country being attacked in this way. But I think we're very anxious to avoid escalation and to say to our friends in Israel, it's a time to think with head as well as heart. And in many ways, this is a double defeat for Iran. Not only was their attack an almost total failure, but also the rest of the world can now see what a malign influence they are in the region and understand their true nature. And so I think it is right for Israel not to escalate, but obviously they're a sovereign independent country and they'll make their own decisions.
You detailed some numbers there. Can you confirm exactly what the British involvement was?
Yes, the British involvement was to effectively backfill what the Americans are doing on Op Shader, which is the operation we've been running for many years now, which is to counter Daesh, ISIL in Syria and Iraq. And so we shifted our aeroplanes to do that work so the Americans could do more over the skies of Israel. But at the same time, we also agreed that if there were drones coming in through that area, that we would shoot them down, and our planes did that. A number of drones, a small number of drones were shot down. So it was that's what happened. I think we should pay testament to the bravery of those pilots and the skills of those pilots for the work that they did.
You said earlier that this was a double failure for Iran, and you detailed why you thought that was the case. There is a school of thought which is espoused by Roger Boys in the Times today, actually, that one of the things that this attack has shown is that Israel can't rely completely on its own defence, on its Iron Dome, that it needs help from countries like America and the United Kingdom. Does that make it look weaker?
Well, Israel's always had a very close defence partnership with the United States, and I think President Biden very clearly said that, we will give you ironclad support, and that's what America did. We helped in the way that I described, really sort of assisting the Americans to do more to help Israel. But I think what the Iran attack shows is just what a threat they are in the region. I mean, this is a country that backs Hamas, that backs Hezbollah in Lebanon, that backs the Houthis in the Red Sea, and now we see it carrying out a state-on-state attack for the first time, directly onto the state of Israel. And that's why one can feel every sympathy. I mean, Israeli people this morning thinking we've suffered this massive attack. Of course, we want our government to respond. And that's why I think, we have to be sensitive in the way we put this, but to say, look, you have had a win because the Iran attack was such a failure. And the smart thing to do, as well as the tough thing to do now, is actually not to escalate. But really what the world should be doing today is pointing at Hamas and saying, right, the Israelis have offered you a deal on hostage release. It's a very generous deal which gives you both a stop in the fighting and also the release of a large number of prisoners. Why aren't you taking that deal? The people that are standing in the way of a stop in the fighting in Gaza are clearly Hamas, and let the attention be on that and on the malign influence of Iran rather than on escalation.
Okay, I'll try to come back to that in a second, Hamas and Gaza. But was it right to ally ourselves so strongly with Israel to defend them from drone attacks. But when we have not done that in the case of Ukraine, we have many people getting in touch with us this morning, Lord Cameron, saying that why is it right in one set of circumstances but not in another?
Well, we've done a huge amount to help Ukraine with its defence. We've trained 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers. We were the first to give anti-tank weapons, the first to give long-range artillery, the first to give tanks, the first to give long-range weapons. And the Ukrainians, whenever you go there, whenever you talk to them, they single out Britain as the country that's done more than anyone else to defend them.
But it's still a different level of support, isn't it?
Well, it's a different situation. I think that's the point. And we have to respond to each situation on its merits and in the right way. But we've given far more to Ukraine for its defense than we have, than others have done, and also than we have to Israel. So I think it is the right thing to do. Look, in this case, we were asked by the Americans to backfill their operation. That released more of their planes to help over the skies of Israel. And I think that was obviously the right thing to do.
And do you consider Iran to be more dangerous than Russia?
Look, they are both dangerous countries. And what you can see even more now is the sort of lining up of this alliance of Russia, Iran, to an extent China, and also North Korea. I mean, the drones that were being used by Iran in Israel are the same drones that are being used by Russia against Ukraine. So look, we're in a far more dangerous world than we've been for decades, and this was a dangerous and reckless act by Iran towards Israel. And so we have, but the thing we must do is try and deal with these conflicts and de-escalate them in each case as best we can. And the best thing to do in the case of Israel is to recognize there's been a failure for Iran. And so they should, as President Biden has said to them, as it were, take the win and then move on to focus on how to eradicate Hamas in Gaza and how to get those hostages freed.
Now, about a week ago, there was a kind of a movement of some opinion, a kind of lessening of support for what Israel was doing in Gaza in terms of the aid workers that were killed and sales of arms to Israel. And there seemed to be some movement. This Iranian attack, of course, has moved the agenda on. But what does that then mean for the people of Gaza? Because perhaps they might have felt that there was some hope, but now there is not.
Well, no, the best thing for the people of Gaza would be a stop in the fighting, which we've been calling for and voting for at the UN for some time now. And that would allow the hostages to come out and for aid to go in. And this morning, as we sit here contemplating this is the moment, as I say, when everyone should be focused on Hamas. Hamas have been offered a deal now for a number of Israeli hostages to be released in exchange for a stop in the fighting, and hundreds of prisoners to be released, Palestinian prisoners to be released for Hamas. They're not taking that deal. They've rejected that deal. So it's absolutely clear today the reason why the fighting is continuing, the reason why the suffering is continuing, is down to Hamas. They could stop it right now, and they should.
I wanted to ask you just two more questions, if I may. Donald Trump, you met him last week. Now, he famously said once that he could end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. Would you think he would make this current situation that we find ourselves in with Israel and Hamas and Iran, do you think he'd make the situation worse or better?
I'm not going to be drawn on what a future Trump presidency might or might do. Look, we will respect the outcome of the American election, whoever is elected, and work with them to try to make sure we make the world safer and make our countries and our alliances stronger, which is the right thing to do at a time of danger. And that was one of the reasons why I met with Donald Trump. It's very traditional for British foreign secretaries to meet, or British prime ministers to meet, leaders of the opposition around the world or potential future presidents. It's a very sensible thing to do, and those were the sorts of discussions that we were having.
Okay. Finally, I wanted to ask you about the Eid celebration at Downing Street. Now, of course, you will have presided over a few of them in your time when you were Prime Minister. There's one going on at Downing Street today. The BBC is reporting that this Eid celebration at Downing Street is going to be boycotted by some Muslim figures who are unhappy with what is happening in Gaza, with British support for the Israeli operation in Gaza, including people like Baroness Varsi, who you remember, of course, resigned from your government saying that your government's policy on the crisis in Gaza at that time was morally indefensible. This could be quite embarrassing. I wonder whether you understand the frustration of people like Baroness Farsi.
Well, all I can say, I had a Eid celebration at the Foreign Office a few days ago, and I think ambassadors from every Arab country turned up to that celebration, as did the ambassador from Israel. So I think all these religious festivals are a time to put aside political differences and think of the things that bring us together. And one of the things that brings us together in Britain is that we're a country with an established church, but also a country that respects other faiths and respects other celebrations. And I think that's the right thing to do. So I'd urge people who get that nice invitation to go to number 10 Downing Street, whether it's Diwali, whether it's Eid, whether it's Easter. They're always very good parties and very well done, and I'd encourage people to go.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking to us. That is David Cameron, Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary.
But there is another view that is espoused, and it comes from the Trump wing of American politics. Richard Goldberg served Donald Trump as his director for countering Iranian weapons of mass destruction. He told us earlier that America shouldn't be discouraging Israel from taking the fight back to Iran.
I don't think we should be pulling Israel back and warning them not to retaliate militarily. I think if Iran pays no military costs, especially in that IRGC infrastructure, maybe even the nuclear program, they have learned a lesson that they can escalate to this extent, and this becomes the new baseline for further escalation. And again, these aren't nuclear-tipped missiles yet. These aren't missiles that can reach Britain or the United States yet, but one day they might be, if Iran internalizes a lesson that there really is no threshold that they can cross that will actually force the West to act. So there has to be a military action, likely by Israel, but also there has to be political and economic steps, and that's where the United Kingdom actually can play a major role. One of the E3 countries, participants still in the Iran nuclear deal, refusing to trigger the snapback of UN sanctions on Iran. There is no reason to delay that any further. That should be something that's worked on, led by Prime Minister Sunak tomorrow. Work with France, Germany, United States, snap back those sanctions from the United Nations. Why are we still dragging our feet on IRGC prescription? Let's just get it done. The IRGC is behind this, so why were we delaying that anymore?
I mean, the great fear here is escalation, isn't it? That's the word. That's the word that is being used. If Israel go back hard militarily, if the world, I suppose, goes hard economically or in other methods, then the argument is this escalates out of control. We end up with World War III. That's the fear, I suppose, that people have.
My answer to that is look at what the current policy of accommodation, appeasement, whatever you want to call it, has led to. Over the last 6 months alone, we don't have to go back through the 40-plus years of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's just go back through the last 6 months of a 7-front war they have been waging against Israel. Nonstop missile, rocket, drone attacks out of southern Lebanon is a new normal now. We just accept that there is a massive amount of warfare going on out of southern Lebanon into Israel, and towns across northern Israel have been evacuated. New normal. Houthis, another client, another proxy of Iran, launching ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones into maritime shipping, into British-owned tankers or vessels, container ships, against the British Navy, against the U.S. Navy, others, nonstop. We now have accepted that as normal. We're just going to play defense against that. No cost for Iran. And now they have taken their escalation step. They just launched 120 ballistic missiles. I don't think everybody listening understands what a ballistic missile is. This is not a tiny homemade rocket like you're used to hearing about Hamas firing for years out of Gaza. This is a weapon that is intended to inflict a lot of damage. Firing 120 of them within an hour, plus 30 cruise missiles, plus 170 suicide drones. That is massive warfare of a scale that is unprecedented. So the idea that we shouldn't act for fear of escalation, my goodness, now we have a new baseline that Iran is starting from. Where do you think this goes to next, other than crossing the nuclear threshold and becoming a nuclear armed threat as well?
What about the argument, Richard, that your point about the level of artillery is well taken, and yet the consequence of that was pretty small? Iran, for all the huffing and puffing, for all of this sending out of all of this hardware, ultimately got nothing through. The defense mobilized, UK and the US mobilized. Israel, of course, dealt with the problem. So at one level, I ask this as a question, I don't know the answer to this. Iran have flexed here, and it didn't actually seem to do anything.
Well, this is one time doing it. So you could call this a test of the system if you like. I call it a massive escalation. They obviously have many, many, many more missiles that they could have used and they could use in the future. They can try to, again, in an actual time where they want to sustain an escalation for whatever reason at their moment of choosing, try to overwhelm these systems. They might not give us a week's notice as they're going back and forth inside their inner sanctum. Should we do this? Should we not do this? Okay, let's do this. While the United States, the United Kingdom, and Israel have a week to figure all this out and think about what are we going to do next. Fully, by the way, commending the British government for acting the way it has, sending its own fighter jets up with the United States military to defend a democratic ally. Bravo to the Prime Minister for doing that in the face of calls just in the last few weeks to try to cut arms sales to Israel. But that can't be the new normal. Yeah. Think about how much money every one of our missiles that we fired off cost. Think about how much every dollar that was spent by Israel and all of its interceptors for 120 ballistic missiles. All of that's going to need to get replenished. If you actually start accepting that as a new normal, it's going to look like the Red Sea looks now, only with ballistic missiles flying throughout the Middle East. We can't allow that to happen.
And just finally, would you endorse Israel's direct military retaliation on Iran? Would you endorse the US supporting that in some way?
I think it has to happen. Now, obviously, the reality is that President Biden right now is trying to pull Israel back. He's opposing this. He's putting some pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu not to have a direct military strike. And so we're just waiting to see what the Israelis decide. I think it's a mistake to signal to the Iranians that we're pulling the Israelis back. I think they have to have a bottom line. Having missile defense is important. The fact that we have funded this for so many years, trained on it, is important so that Iran knows and the world sees that you can't just knock in one wave the Jewish state off the map. But that doesn't mean they don't have a right to defend themselves and impose consequences on Iran so that doesn't happen again.
That's Richard Goldberg there. He served Donald Trump as his director for countering Iranian weapons of mass destruction. And the argument is that if you don't do a direct response to Iran, this becomes the new normal when it comes to their base level of operations against Israel.